Earlier this year, a black man named George Floyd was unjustly killed by a police officer. Following this, the United States saw massive protests across the country in response to racial inequality. Thousands of people fled to the streets to protest the police brutality and systemic racism. Not only were these protests going on for months, this initiated a thorough discussion of systemic racism that's ingrained in every aspect of our lives. An important conversation that stemmed from these protests was the advocacy for the removal of Confederate statues. These statues, which depict Confederate leaders, represent generations of oppression, racism, and white supremacy. In this speech, I will discuss the research I've done to display the need for the removal of Confederate statues using three main points. First, we'll take a look at the history behind this problem and its significant connection to collective memory. Then we'll move on to discussing why problems associated with systemic racism are inherent to our status quo. Finally, I'll conclude with my proposed solutions. But first, in my research, I found that this problem is seen through various white supremacist opinions that argue that these Confederate statues are not representative of racism. In 2019, Ellen Hunt, a University of Minnesota JD Law candidate, published an article in Law and Inequality, a journal of theory and practice, in which she states that some argue that Confederate monuments should be honored or at least respected as articles of history. They argue that the monuments serve as historically appropriate memorials erected by survivors. The problem is that many believe these offensive statues are representative of history. To understand why many people defend Confederate statues, we need to look to a field of cultural studies called collective memory. In my research, I found that collective memory lies at the root of this problem. Collective memory leads to attitudes of white supremacy. A 2011 journal published by Melanie L. Buffington, a Virginia Commonwealth University assistant professor, and Aaron Waldner, a Virginia Commonwealth University graduate student, explained that collective memories can be formed through people's susceptibility to the rhetoric of a dominant group with power to circulate ideas, regardless of historical accuracy. In other words, collective memory is the way a certain societal group teaches its members about how to remember and honor history, even if that method is outdated and incorrect. So if people are told to honor these statues that represent white supremacy, they will develop racist attitudes. One of the biggest problems we deal with is systemic racism. And in my speech, when I use this term, I'm going to refer to the definition given by Joe Fagan, a Texas A&M sociology professor, and Bernice Barnett, a University of Illinois sociology professor. In their 2005 article, Success and Failure, How Systemic Racism Trumped the Brown v. Board of Education Decision, they explain that systemic racism involves the racialized exploitation and subordination of Americans of color by white Americans. At the heart of systemic racism are discriminatory practices that generally deny Americans of color the dignity, opportunities, and privileges available to whites individually and collectively. This term refers to the deeply ingrained racist ideologies in every aspect of our society. It's the attitudes caused by collective memory that deepen the systemic racism we see in our country. Confederate statues are defended by people who share a collective memory, but this ideology contributes to harmful systemic racism, racial inequality, and white supremacy. Collective memory is so important to this controversy, which brings us to our next point, where we discuss why problems associated with systemic racism are inherent to our status quo. The links established between collective memory and the current racist attitudes of people continues to go even further. The attitudes of racism due to collective memory of Confederate statues has manifested into practice, as seen through police brutality today. Michael Siegel, a community health sciences professor at Boston University, published an article this year on the racial disparities in fatal police shootings, in which he states, "In many ways, it appears that current racial disparities in police violence are determined by the power differential and use of that power to oppress and disadvantage Black people that occurred in the past. These racist attitudes that formed because of collective memory are the reason for current police violence against minority groups. Ideologies that came from events that transpired decades ago are still causing systemic racism today. This goes to show that the problems of collective memory and racist attitudes aren't going to go away on their own. Instead, it's deepening the racial divide in every part of our society. This also proves that collective memory is the real problem. Even if these values stemmed from generations ago, the current attitudes of people still have consequences like police brutality. Racist attitudes that stem from collective memories will continue to cause problems for years to come. These ingrained issues of systemic racism aren't going away within time. They're still inherent to our status quo. This leads me to my final point, where I'm going to talk about different types of solvency to this problem, which are both value-based and policy-based. At both the state and national level, there needs to be legislation to remove Confederate statues. Former Confederate states like Alabama and Virginia still have a lot of these statues still standing, so we need policies that promote the removal of Confederate statues. On a value-based level, taking down these statues is the right and justified thing to do, even if there aren't any practical solutions. Here I want to dive into a field of philosophical studies to explain the social justice behind removing these statues. In 2004, Tommy Shelby, an assistant professor at Harvard University, published an article called Race and Social Justice, Rawlsian Considerations, in which he states that Rawls holds that within a political conception of justice, all persons, regardless of their racial identity, should be regarded as free and equal. These statues are representative of white supremacy, which caused the systemic racism that directly prevents many from having actual equality. The truth is, justice is achieved even if these statues come down without any laws changing. Removing Confederate statues is the right and justified thing to do, even if nothing else follows. An example I want to shine light upon is how Germany dealt with the aftermath of the Holocaust. In 2013, Alexandra Kaufman, a graduate student at West Virginia University, published a master's thesis called Houses of History and Homepages, Museums of Communism in Eastern and Central Europe and Their Online Presence, in which she stated that both East and West Germany dealt with concentration camp preservation and memorization. Dealing with the intense and emotional memory of Holocaust set a precedent of public remembrances, memorials, and education on difficult historical issues. I suggest that we do something similar. We shouldn't deny our past, we should own up to it. In order to really solve these issues of racial inequality, we need to solve these ingrained problems of racism. We need to change collective memory. Taking down a Confederate statue or changing policies isn't going to change the way people feel about them. Until we start rethinking our place in the world, changing policies won't matter. While this process may be slow, it's an important step to evolving towards a more racially equal society. The advocacy for the removal of Confederate statues found new momentum this year following the protests against racial inequality. Removing Confederate statues is a very important step, even if there's no policy change to follow it. However, it's just a part of the process to ending all systemic racism and attitudes of white supremacy today. In order to evolve towards a more equal society, we have to change the way in which we remember and honor history. We have to change our collective memory. Collective memory creates attitudes among the people that leads to the deeper integration of racism in our society. Until we change the way we perceive these positions in the world, no policy that is passed will matter.